we're starting to get into some of the more specific techniques. But before we jump into the more dense, slightly more difficult theories, I just want to cover some of the basics to lay a relatively good surface level foundation that we can then build some of the more difficult things on later. So these are just some very general and very basic tips and tricks that you can start applying. But it's important to realize that it is still very basic. It really only makes up, the top 10% of this iceberg. It's not going to be the thing that makes a massive difference, like the 90% underneath it. The 90% underneath it is if you have a big issue with the way that you're studying or the way that you're thinking about learning, then it's the 90% that's probably going to fix that. The top 10% is just some basic stuff to get some of those gears turning initially. But again, it is all very basic, but I think what you're going to recognize when you get into it is that these tips are almost held on this pedestal, like a holy grail of studying techniques that every YouTube guru or your family friend, or you might have heard through word of mouth, kind of pitches it like this is the be-all, end-all of studying techniques, and this is where it starts and stops. But really, it is just very basic stuff, and the reason that these techniques are kind of hyped up to a lot more than they should be is because this is the stuff that's just really available on the surface that people know about. These are the really easiest, most basic things that are easy to share through word of mouth. You can explain it in a couple minutes through a YouTube video. So as a result, these tips end up being pretty commonly known, but they're not the most meaningful material. They're not the most meaningful strategies. They're not the best techniques. They're not even the best version of the technique that they're talking about. That's what we're going to cover through the system. So you don't have to worry. We'll cover the tips that everyone knows about, and then you'll be just as good as everyone else. And then we're going to cover the 90% that most people don't know, so that you can just really rise above that. And that's going to be in a full system, beginning to end, so you can use it for any subject, any topic, any variation, any environment, any mental state. It's very comprehensive, covering everything that you'd need to know to be an excellent student, not just the tips that everyone else is preaching. And the other thing is that the systems that we're going to be teaching you, these are, especially the 90% underneath, these are the things that are fundamentally evidence-based, which means that it's based on the research on neuroscience and psychology and learning psychology and how all of that works. So they basically work for most people, as long as you're a human being watching this, which presumably you are. It's just a fundamental way that the human brain works. So most of the things in the system, except for the stuff at the very end of the course, will be stuff that is just generally very applicable for everyone, no matter how you are individually different. It's kind of like your brain is still 99.9% the same as pretty much everyone else's brain. And this is what it's taking advantage of. And that final 0.1% of modification, I'll introduce that nearer to the end when we can really start adding a little bit more of your individuality into your studying technique. But for now and for the immediate future, just focus on these foundations, because it's what works for pretty much anyone to get them to a really high level and really, really solid foundation of effective and efficient learning.